Welcome to An Author's Voice, where I'll discuss the craft behind writing and illustrate the points with my own work or discuss other well-known examples. OODA loops for editing. When you're stuck in rewrite hell, version after version, and none of them actually better, the problem usually isn't your writing skill. It's something quieter, something most writers never name. Most revisions fight themselves. Here's why. Every working writer has felt the difference between a revision session that compounded, where the draft genuinely got better, structurally, in ways that held, and a session that felt productive in the moment, but produced a draft that wasn't actually any stronger. Same writer, same craft skill. Two sessions that looked identical from the outside. One worked, one didn't, and most of us file the difference under mood or fatigue and move on. It isn't skill, and it isn't mood. It's a missing step in how you revise, and once you can name the step, you can stop skipping it. So today I want to do two things. First, show you what the conventional passes model, developmental, line, copy, is hiding from you about what revision actually is, and second, give you a four-stage loop, borrowed from somewhere outside writing entirely, that names the move where the craft thinking actually happens. The move most writers cut out of their revision sessions without ever realizing they've cut anything at all. The passes model wasn't a mistake, it was a fix for a real problem. Writers who revise without structure tend to polish the surface prose, while the structural issues sit underneath, untouched. They spend an hour rewriting a paragraph that should have been cut. They miss the chapter break that's in the wrong place. And they come out of the session with a manuscript that reads a little better at the sentence level, and is no closer to working at the book level. The passes model, developmental first, then line, then copy, solves that. It forces the big issues to the front. It prevents wasted polish on prose that's about to be deleted. And it gives you a sequence to follow when instinct won't tell you what to fix next. That's a real win, and my argument depends on conceding it. The passes model is genuinely useful, especially for writers who haven't yet internalized story structure deeply enough to revise without scaffolding. But the passes model is a scheduling metaphor. It tells you the order to do things in. It doesn't tell you what you're actually doing when you revise, what the operation looks like underneath the schedule. And writers who stop at the schedule have only modeled half the work. The half they've left unmodeled is exactly where revisions either compound or burn. The framework I want to borrow comes from a fighter pilot. John Boyd, working on air combat doctrine in the 1950s, noticed something strange. The pilot who wins a dogfight isn't the one with the faster reflexes. It's the one whose decision cycle is more accurately oriented. The one who keeps making moves that address the actual situation, while his opponent is making moves that address an imagined one. Boyd called that cycle the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, and it migrated out of cockpits and into business strategy, security operations, anywhere people make decisions under pressure with imperfect information. And revision is exactly that: imperfect information, decisions under pressure, a cycle you run, often without noticing, every single time you touch a draft. So let's walk the four stages, applied to editing. Observe. Read what's actually on the page, not what you intended, not what you remember writing 6 months ago. What's there on this read today? Orient. Frame what you just observed against your structural model. What is this scene trying to do? What does the chapter owe the larger arc? What does the genre contract ask of this beat? What does the character's voice in this passage need? This is the step that does the craft work. This is where your knowledge of story gets applied to the raw observation. Decide. Choose the specific move. Once you've oriented correctly, deciding is usually fast and obvious. The fix is implied by the framing. Act. Make the change. And then the loop closes. You observe again. The new prose is new evidence, and the loop runs again on the changed material. Orient against it. Decide again. Act again. Here's the key insight. Orient is where the thinking actually lives. It's where you reach into everything you know about story, genre, voice, character, and pacing, and use it to interpret what you've read. Drop that step, and revision becomes raw observation, feeding straight into raw action, which is exactly what panicked, unstructured revision feels like from the inside. You read a passage, you feel friction, you change something. You read again, feel friction, change something else. No frame, no accumulating model, just twitching at the prose. The loop has another quiet strength. It delivers its own feedback. You don't need an editorial letter or a critique partner to tell you what comes next. The change you just made becomes the next thing you observe, and reorienting against it surfaces the next move. Every turn of the loop generates the input for the turn after it. The feedback is built in, and that self-feedback is also how the loop tells you when to stop. You run it on the scene, then on the chapter, then on the whole book, and you keep running it until a full turn produces no change, until you observe, orient, and find nothing the framing asks you to decide. That's a real stopping condition, not just fatigue. A finished scene isn't one you've gotten tired of looking at. It's one where the loop runs clean. So where do the traditional passes fit? They collapse into the loop, not the other way around. A dev pass is just a series of OODA loops where you're orienting on structure. A line pass is a series of OODA loops where you're orienting on the prose. Same operation, different scale. Pretending they're separate is what makes the boundaries leak, because every line edit can surface a structural problem, and every structural fix forces you to rewrite at the line level. The passes model schedules revision. The loop describes it, and most writers know the schedule, but they've never named the operation. If the operation is the loop, then the failure mode is the missing step. And in my experience, almost every revision that didn't compound is a revision that collapsed, observed straight into act, and skipped orient entirely. So here's the diagnostic question. Between reading a passage and deciding to change it, can you name the structural model you use to interpret what you read? If the honest answer is, I just felt it was off, then you skipped orient. The friction was real. The interpretation was missing. There are three common shapes this skip takes. The first is the Polish reflex. You read a passage, you feel friction, and you start tightening sentences. And the friction might be prose level, but it might just as easily be a structural problem showing up as prose friction. The scene's job is unclear. The character's point of view obligation isn't being met. A setup is missing. The friction is real, but the cause is somewhere else entirely, and polishing the surface buries that signal under cleaner prose. The next time you read the chapter, the friction is back, and now it's harder to find, because the surface is smooth. The second is the Titan reflex. Cutting words feels productive. Word counts go down, the red ink goes up, the session feels like it's accomplishing something. But cutting words before you orient means you might be cutting the very prose that's load-bearing for a structural beat you haven't framed yet. The clearest version of this? The writer who tightens a long passage into a clean, sharp paragraph, and then realizes, 3 chapters later, that the prose she cut was carrying a setup the payoff now lacks. The tightening was pristine. The structural function was erased. The third is instinct trust. Experienced writers have internalized Orient enough that it sometimes runs unconsciously, and sometimes that's reliable. The trouble is, you can't always tell the difference between I oriented automatically and I skipped to decide and called it Orient. And long drafts make this worse. By chapter 22, your unconscious sense of what an earlier scene was doing has been corrupted by everything that happened in chapters 1 through 21. The revision feels right, and the result contradicts chapter 4. So here's the move. It's simple and a little annoying. After you read a passage, before you change anything, write one sentence naming what that passage is trying to do, at the scene, the chapter, and the arc level. If you can't write the sentence, you haven't oriented, so don't decide yet. In practice, this turns your margin notes from fix this into something better. This passage's job is X, and the prose isn't doing X because Y. The first half forces orient. The second half feeds decide. And that single discipline, naming the purpose before you authorize the change, is what turns a revision session from word shuffling into structural work. Here's the one-liner, if you want one. If your revision session changed the prose without changing your understanding of any scene's job, you weren't running a loop. You were polishing. Now, the honest concession. Some writers have internalized story structure so deeply that they orient unconsciously and reliably, and for them, forcing the sentence is just friction, with no added signal. But most of us, even experienced writers, have patchy Orient. And the forced loop is most valuable exactly when you're sure you don't need it. The move is to notice the difference between unconscious Orient that's reliable and unconscious Orient that you've simply stopped checking. The forced sentence is how you check. 20 seconds on the chapters where your instinct was already right, and on the chapters where it wasn't. The cost of skipping it is the next 3 drafts. Externalizing Orient, putting the framing into language somewhere outside your own head, in a margin note, in a working document, in whatever scaffolding helps, is one way to keep the discipline honest. What matters is that the framing exists, in words, before the first change gets made. The form it takes is up to you. So here's where we land, the Pass's Model Schedules Revision. The OODA loop describes what revision actually is, and writers who learn only the schedule keep skipping the step where the craft actually happens. The replacement is the loop. Watch yourself for that observe-to-act collapse. Force a one-sentence Orient before any change, and slow down by exactly the amount required to make every change structurally informed. No more, no less. The compound interest pays out across the whole draft, because every change you make is now framed against the same accumulating model of the work, instead of being a string of disconnected reactions to whatever friction the last paragraph happened to throw at you. So try one experiment in your next revision session. After you read a passage, before you change anything, write a single sentence naming what that passage is supposed to do. And notice how often you can't. That gap between what you've read and what you can actually articulate as its purpose is the loop you've been failing to close. Closing it is the entire game. And when you've closed it everywhere, every scene, then every chapter, until a full loop turns up nothing left to change, the loop runs clean, and that's the closest thing you'll ever get to the draft itself telling you it's done. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear or read more of this sort of thing, subscribe to my email list and follow me on social media using the link below, or search online for Charlie For It, and you will likely find me. Until next time, thanks for following along. Voices for this recording provided by Speechify. All content written by Charlie For It. Any opinions expressed in this recording are solely the author's. Learn more at charliefora.com.